If you ever want to know what kind of person someone really is, don't watch what they do when the lights are on, watch who they notice when the whole station is trying not to see. Dock 9 never really slept. It just changed shifts. By midnight, the freight cranes moved slower, the smugglers got bolder, and the rain started falling in thin silver lines from the rusted underbelly of the transit decks above. It wasn't real rain, not the kind Ethan Cole remembered from childhood summers back in Oregon. This stuff smelled like hot copper and old batteries, and if it sat on bare skin too long, it left behind a faint chemical itch that no soap ever fully washed away. Ethan stepped out of Bay 14 with a wrench still in one hand and engine grease dried along the edge of his thumb. His lower back ached, his knees felt twice their age, and his work shirt clung damp to his shoulders beneath his thermal jacket. 12 hours under broken cargo haulers would do that to a man. The loading alarms had finally gone quiet, leaving only the distant groan of docking clamps and the soft electric buzz of half-dead neon signs reflecting in puddles on the steel walkway. He was 3 blocks from the cheapest cup of coffee on the station and one bad paycheck away from having to choose between rent and oxygen tax again. So no, Ethan was not looking for trouble. Trouble, unfortunately, was sitting under a flickering ad board for luxury orbital cruises, wrapped in nothing but a torn silver-gray blanket and the blue-white corpse of a portable heater. He almost kept walking. Almost. At first glance, she looked like one of the station drifters, another refugee, runaway, or casualty of a system built to move cargo faster than it moved compassion. Dock 9 collected people the same way drain grates collected rainwater. But something about her made him slow down. Maybe it was the way she sat. Not slumped. Not begging. Just still. Her back was against the support column, one knee bent, one hand resting lightly over the dead heater in her lap as if she'd been waiting for it to come back to life through sheer stubbornness. The overhead sign above her glitched every few seconds, washing her in pulses of gold and violet light. That was when he saw her clearly. Turquoise skin, dulled by cold. White hair damp at the ends, hanging loose over one shoulder like spilled wire. Bare feet tucked under her. And eyes, when she lifted them to him, eyes the color of pale amber glass, too clear and too sharp for someone who'd given up. Ethan stopped. "You planning on freezing to death out here," he said, "or is this just a temporary hobby?" Her gaze stayed on him for a second longer than most people's did, like she was deciding whether he was worth the energy it would take to answer. "I'm not freezing," she said at last. Her voice was low, smooth, and unmistakably educated. "Not station-born. Not even close." "Aha." Ethan looked down at the heater. "And I'm not broke." She followed his glance, then looked away. "It stopped working." "Yeah," he said. "I gathered that from the part where it's dead." He expected irritation. Maybe pride. Maybe the kind of cold silence that told him to mind his own business. Instead, she just stared ahead at the rain sliding off the overhead rails, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask for money. Didn't ask for food. Didn't ask for anything. That was the part that got under his skin. Dock 9 taught people to ask or disappear. She was doing neither. Ethan shifted his weight and exhaled through his nose. "There's a maintenance room back in Bay 14, he said. "Space heater works. Most of the time. Dry floor. No one'll bother you till morning." She gave a small, humorless smile that barely touched her face. "You assume I need saving." "No," Ethan said. "I assume you need heat." For the first time, something changed in her expression. Not softness exactly. More like surprise that he'd chosen the simpler truth. The station lights hummed overhead. Somewhere below them, a cargo siren wailed and then faded into the steel bones of the dock. She looked back down at the dead heater in her lap as if weighing the dignity of suffering against the indignity of accepting help. Ethan knew that calculation. He'd made it himself more than once. "I'm not asking twice," he said, shrugging one shoulder. "Take the room or don't." But if you're still sitting here in 20 minutes, I'm bringing you coffee anyway, and then you'll owe me conversation. This time, the smile was real, small, reluctant, and gone almost as soon as it appeared. She looked up at him again, rainlight flickering across her face, and for one strange second Ethan had the ridiculous feeling that he was standing in front of someone who had once been obeyed by entire rooms. "You are very persistent," she said quietly. Ethan shoved his free hand into his jacket pocket and gave her a tired half-smirk. "Lady, you have no idea." Then he held out his hand, not because she looked weak, but because the metal beneath her had gone cold enough to steal heat through fabric, and because something in her eyes told him she'd been alone longer than one bad night could explain. She looked at his hand for a long moment. Then, without a word, she reached for it. The maintenance room behind Bay 14 was barely big enough to be called a room. It was more like a metal box someone had forgotten to throw away, with one narrow bench bolted to the wall, a dented supply locker, and an old industrial heater in the corner that rattled like it had opinions about staying alive. But it was dry, it was warm, and on Dock 9 that already made it better than most apartments. Ethan keyed the door open and stepped aside. "Luxury accommodations," he said. "Try not to leave a bad review." The woman hesitated in the doorway, her pale amber eyes sweeping the cramped space with the kind of quiet attention people used when they had once lived somewhere much larger. Then she stepped inside without a word. Ethan shut the door behind them, and the outside noise dulled at once, reduced to a low metallic hum beyond the walls. The heater coughed once, then continued its tired growl, pushing out a stream of dry warmth that smelled faintly like dust and hot wiring. She moved closer to it immediately, though she tried to make it look accidental. Ethan pretended not to notice. "Sit," he said, setting his wrench on the worktable by the door. "You look like you are about 10 minutes away from turning into decorative station ice." "Your concern is excessive," she said, but there was less edge in her voice now. "That is what my ex used to say." He shrugged out of his thermal jacket and tossed it onto the bench. "Difference is, I am usually right." She looked at the jacket, then at him. "And what exactly makes you think I would accept your clothing?" Ethan stared at her for a beat, then let out a tired laugh through his nose. "You are sitting in a repair closet behind a cargo bay at 1 a.m. holding a dead heater like it owes you money. I think we are past formalities." For the first time, she did not answer immediately. She lowered herself onto the bench with a kind of careful control that made even exhaustion look deliberate. Up close, the signs of the cold were easier to see. A faint tremor in her fingers. Damp silver-white strands of hair stuck to the side of her neck. The hollow stillness of someone running on pride and very little else. Ethan turned to the small wall unit near the sink and smacked it twice until the old water dispenser blinked awake. "You hungry?" he asked. "No, that means yes." He opened the locker beneath the counter and found what he had expected, 2 protein bars, half a bag of salted crackers, and a cup of instant noodles he had forgotten existed. He held up the cup. "Fine dining tonight." Her eyes flicked to it, then away with something that looked suspiciously like confusion. "You eat that by choice?" "Only on special occasions." He tore open the packet, added water from the dispenser, and shoved the cup under the heating coil mounted above the sink. The room filled slowly with the cheap, salty smell of synthetic broth. When he turned back, she was watching every movement he made with unnerving focus, like he was either fascinating or deeply incompetent. Possibly both. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "It is simply strange." "What is?" She looked down at her hands. "That you have so little, and still offer part of it away." Ethan leaned one hip against the counter. Outside, a freight hauler clanged somewhere across the bay, the vibration humming softly through the floor under his boots. "That is kind of how having little works," he said. "You get good at noticing when someone else has less." She looked up then, and something in her face shifted. Not pity. Not gratitude exactly. More like she had just been handed a sentence that did not fit with the math she used to understand the world. The noodles were ready. Ethan carried them over and offered the cup. She stared at it like it might be ceremonial. "It is not poison," he said. Very comforting to hear. But after a second, she took it. Her fingers brushed his for half a heartbeat, cold enough to surprise him. She wrapped both hands around the warmth of the cup and just held it there for a moment, letting the steam rise against her face. Then, carefully, she took a bite. Ethan expected the usual reaction from off-worlders trying dock food for the first time. Disgust. Regret. Mild spiritual collapse. Instead, she went still. Not because it was good. It absolutely was not. But because she was hungry enough that even bad food had become something sacred. She took another bite, slower this time, as if trying not to reveal too much. Ethan looked away to give her the privacy of dignity, and that was when he noticed it. The heater panel she had been holding earlier sat on the bench beside her, cracked open at the seam. He had not seen her touch it. But now the wiring inside had been rearranged with clean, precise adjustments no drifter on Dock 9 should have known how to make. Ethan stared at it for a second, then at her. She kept eating, eyes lowered, as if nothing about this was unusual. "You know," he said slowly, "most homeless people do not rewire thermal regulators by hand." She lifted her gaze, amber eyes unreadable over the rim of the steaming cup. "And most mechanics," she said softly, "do not offer shelter to strangers who might be dangerous." Ethan folded his arms. "That sounds less like an answer and more like a warning." A faint smile touched her mouth. Small. Tired. Entirely too controlled. "Perhaps," she said, "it is both." By 2:30 station time, the heater had settled into a steady mechanical rattle and the rain outside had softened into a whisper against the bay walls, but Ethan still had not gone home. He told himself it was because Bay 14 had a coolant valve that needed replacing before the morning crew showed up. He told himself it had nothing to do with the turquoise-skinned stranger sitting on his bench in his jacket, holding a cup of instant noodles like it belonged in a museum. Neither explanation was especially convincing. She had finished eating but had not moved toward the door. Ethan had not asked her to leave. The silence between them was not awkward exactly. It was watchful. Like both of them were waiting to see which truth would walk into the room first. Ethan crossed back to the worktable and picked up the dead heater she had repaired. The outer shell was still scratched to hell and one of the vent grills was hanging on by a single bent clip, but inside, the rewiring was clean enough to make him frown. Not improvised. Intentional. Efficient. Better than factory, actually. He turned the unit over in his hands and glanced at her. "You ever worked maintenance?" She looked at him over the rim of the cup, now empty except for a thin curl of steam. "No," Ethan lifted an eyebrow. That was a very fast answer. It was also truthful. "Aha." He set the heater down on the table and folded his arms. Because most people who have never worked maintenance do not casually rebuild a thermal regulator with no tools. Most people, she said, do not design things to break in the first place. Ethan blinked once. Then again. "You designed heaters?" "No, ships." "No, station systems." "No," her expression remained perfectly calm. "I said I do not work maintenance. I did not say I have never corrected bad engineering." Ethan let out a short breath that might have become a laugh if he had not been too tired to commit to it. "You know, for someone trying very hard to look anonymous, you keep saying things that sound expensive." Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. There it was again, that almost invisible reaction. A flicker. Not fear. Not exactly guilt. More like she had spent a long time learning how not to answer questions and was beginning to resent how easily he noticed. "And you," she said after a moment, "speak like someone who should have left this place years ago." Ethan leaned against the worktable and looked at her for a second before answering. I did leave. He was not sure why he said it. Maybe because she had asked without sounding curious for sport. Maybe because she did not seem like the kind of person who filled silence just to avoid honesty. Mars freight routes for 4 years. Then a refinery platform over Ceres. Then one contract on a long-haul repair tug that paid great and nearly froze my lungs out. He shrugged one shoulder. Dock 9 just happened to be where I landed when I ran out of reasons to keep moving. And now, she asked. Now I fix things other people break and try not to die of rent. For the first time since he met her, something in her face softened enough to be unmistakably human. Sadness did not belong to one species, Ethan guessed. It just wore different skin. She looked down at the cup in her hands. That sounds, she said quietly, like a very poor system. Welcome to civilization. The corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile. Then a sound cut through the room. Soft. Metallic. So faint Ethan nearly missed it. A single chime from somewhere under the folds of the silver-gray blanket draped over her lap. Both of them froze. Ethan looked up. She had gone completely still, not like a frightened person, but like someone whose body had just switched from weary to alert in one heartbeat. What was that? He asked. Nothing. That was definitely not nothing. She set the empty cup aside with careful hands and reached for the blanket too quickly. Ethan moved on instinct, not grabbing, just stepping close enough to catch the edge before she could cover whatever was underneath. The fabric slipped. For half a second, neither of them breathed. Resting against her thigh was a device no one on Dock 9 should have owned. It was no bigger than a deck of cards, matte black with a thin ring of dim gold light pulsing at the center. Sleek. Seamless. Military or executive grade, maybe both. Not cheap. Not legal in half the sectors Ethan had worked in. And definitely not something a homeless drifter should have been carrying around in the rain. He looked at the device, then at her. Her amber eyes met his without blinking. You want to tell me why a woman sleeping under a broken ad board is carrying hardware worth more than my entire bay? He asked. She did not answer right away. Outside, somewhere beyond the steel wall, a cargo shuttle descended with a low atmospheric whine, and the room trembled faintly around them. When she finally spoke, her voice was very calm. Too calm. Because, she said, if the wrong people find me before morning, that little device will be the least expensive. Reason your life becomes complicated. Ethan had worked around enough bad situations to recognize the moment one stopped being strange and started becoming dangerous. It was never loud at first. Never dramatic. It was always something small. A sentence that landed too clean. A piece of tech that did not belong. A person who looked exhausted but kept watching the exits. He set the black and gold device down slowly on the work table between them and kept his hands where she could see them. All right, he said. You have exactly one chance to convince me I did not just invite a full-blown station incident into my maintenance closet. The woman sat very still on the bench, Ethan's jacket hanging from her shoulders, silver-white hair drying in uneven strands against the dark fabric. In the weak yellow light of the heater, she looked less like a drifter and more like someone wearing hardship incorrectly. Not because she was above suffering. Because suffering did not seem native to her. It sat on her like borrowed clothing. Her gaze dropped to the device for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before. I am not here to harm you. That is not actually an answer. It is the most important one. Ethan stared at her. You have expensive hardware, a talent for fixing things nobody should know how to fix, and whatever that little gold brick is just chimed like somebody is looking for you. He nodded toward the table. So let us try this again. Who are you? She did not answer. The heater rattled in the corner. Somewhere out in the bay, an overhead cargo chain shifted with a hollow metallic clank that echoed through the wall. Ethan waited. She looked toward the door instead of at him, as if she could somehow see through 3 inches of steel and into the wet neon night outside. "If I tell you the truth," she said at last, "you will ask me to leave." Ethan gave a dry, tired exhale. "That depends very heavily on the truth." Her fingers tightened slightly in the blanket over her lap. "And if I do not tell you," she said, "you will stop helping me." "That depends very heavily on the lie." For a second, Ethan thought she might actually laugh. Not because anything was funny. More because she had not expected resistance to feel this ordinary. It changed the room somehow. Took some of the edge off whatever invisible wall she had built around herself. "My name is Lyra," she said. That part was real. Ethan nodded once. "Good start." "I am in transit." "That is a terrible continuation." A flicker of irritation crossed her face, but it was almost immediately replaced by something closer to reluctant respect. "You are very difficult to mislead." Occupational hazard. She looked at him then, fully this time, and there was something different in her expression now. Not superiority. Assessment. As if she was reclassifying him into a category she had not prepared for. "I was not supposed to be here," she said carefully. "My transport changed course unexpectedly. I left before I was meant to." There were disagreements. Ethan folded his arms. With who? People who believe proximity gives them ownership. That answer landed somewhere deeper than he expected. He did not know what exactly had happened to her, and he had the distinct feeling he was only getting one polished edge of a much uglier truth, but that sentence had not sounded rehearsed. It had sounded lived in. Ethan glanced down at the device again. "And that thing?" "A locator relay." "Yours?" "Technically." Technically is not a comforting word. It was not meant to activate tonight. And yet. Lyra looked away, jaw tightening for the first time since he had met her. It should have stayed dark until dawn. Ethan studied her for a long moment, then walked to the sink and splashed cold water over his hands, more to think than to clean. The metal basin clicked softly under the impact. He looked at his reflection in the scratched wall panel above it. 34 years old. Grease in his cuticles. Permanent shadows under his eyes. A man with exactly enough money to survive and apparently just enough conscience to make terrible decisions at 1 in the morning. "So what happens at dawn?" he asked. Behind him, the room went quiet. Too quiet. He turned. Lyra was no longer looking at him. She was looking at the narrow vent panel above the door. Her entire body had gone still in a way Ethan had learned never to ignore. Not fear. Recognition. "Do not move too quickly," she said, very softly. Ethan followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing but rusted vent slats and shadow. Then a tiny red reflection blinked once from inside the grate. So small it could have been a sensor. Or a lens. Ethan felt the back of his neck go cold despite the heater. "Tell me," he said without taking his eyes off the vent, "that Bay 14 does not suddenly come with surveillance." Lyra rose slowly from the bench, every trace of fatigue replaced by razor-thin focus. Her voice, when it came, was no longer weary or uncertain. It was calm in a way that made calm sound dangerous. "It does not," she said. "Which means someone found me faster than they were supposed to." For one suspended second, neither of them moved. The tiny red light inside the vent blinked once more, then disappeared, as if whatever had been watching had just pulled back into the ductwork. Ethan stared at the metal slats above the door and felt the room shrink around him. The maintenance closet had always been too small, but now it felt sealed. Observed. Claimed by a problem much larger than old tools and leaking coolant lines. "Tell me that is not what I think it is," he said quietly. Lyra did not look away from the vent. "That depends on how imaginative you are. I am tired, underpaid, and standing in my own bay at almost 3 in the morning with a mystery woman and a spy device in the wall. My imagination is doing just fine. She moved first. Fast, but controlled. Not panicked. Never panicked. She crossed to the work table, picked up the black and gold locator relay, and pressed her thumb to its smooth surface. The dim gold ring brightened for half a second, then went dark completely. Dead. Or hidden. Ethan could not tell. What did you just do? He asked. Bought us a few minutes, she said. Us? Ethan repeated. Interesting choice of pronoun. You stopped being uninvolved when you opened the door. He hated how true that sounded. Outside the closet, Bay 14 groaned softly as the overhead freight tracks shifted into low-power night cycle. The station had that strange hollow stillness that came only in the hours before dawn, when most decent people were asleep and everyone else was making decisions they would regret by breakfast. Ethan took one slow breath and reached for the only thing in the room that made him feel remotely useful, his tool belt. Hanging from a wall hook. He fastened it around his waist out of instinct more than necessity. Wrenches, pry tool, voltage tester, compact torch. Nothing heroic. Just the ordinary armor of a man whose whole life had been fixing systems designed by people who never had to crawl inside them. Okay, he said, forcing his voice steady. You have about 30 seconds to explain why something is peeking through my vent before I decide this is above my pay grade and call station security. Lyra turned to face him, and for the first time since he had met her, there was no careful distance in her expression. No polished restraint. Just direct, urgent honesty. If you call station security, she said, they will not protect you. They will notify the same people who sent that. Ethan looked at the vent again. And who exactly are those people? The kind who do not ask twice when they want someone returned. Returned. Not found. Not rescued. Returned. The word sat wrong in his chest. Ethan had heard enough in one night to know when language mattered. He studied her face, the set of her jaw, the way she stood with one shoulder angled toward the door like she had been trained to anticipate movement before it happened. Homeless was officially off the table. You are not some runaway thief, are you? He asked. No, corporate defector. No, diplomat. She hesitated. That was all the answer he needed. Ethan let out a long breath through his nose and rubbed a hand over his face. Fantastic, he muttered. I brought a political incident home. A tiny sound escaped her then. Not quite a laugh, but dangerously close. You say that, she said, as if your evening was not already going poorly. Lady, my evening crossed poorly about 10 minutes after I offered you noodles. The red light blinked again. This time, not from the vent. From the seam beneath the outer bay door. Both of them saw it. A narrow line of moving illumination swept once across the floor, then disappeared. Scanning. Ethan's pulse kicked hard against his ribs. That, he said, I do not like. Lyra stepped closer to him without seeming to mean to. Her voice dropped lower. How well do you know this bay? Ethan almost answered with something sarcastic, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She was serious. Not scared for herself exactly. Scared on principle. Like she had already accepted danger as part of her own life and only regretted that it had spilled onto someone else's floor. Every bolt, he said. Good. She nodded once toward the back wall where old supply shelving blocked off a narrow maintenance passage Ethan had not used in months. Then I suggest you show me where that goes. He looked from her to the shelf, then back to the door where another faint line of scanning light traced silently across the metal. Somewhere outside, boots or machinery or something heavier than either of them shifted just beyond the threshold. Ethan should have been angry. Or smarter. Or at the very least more interested in self-preservation than whatever stupid moral reflex had gotten him into this mess. Instead, he found himself stepping toward the shelf. You know, he said under his breath, bracing both hands against the rusted frame, next time I offer shelter to a stranger, I am asking at least 3 follow-up questions. Lyra moved beside him, one hand catching the opposite side of the shelving unit. Her silver-white hair brushed the shoulder of his jacket as she leaned in to help. That, she said softly, would be very wise. Together they shoved. Metal groaned against concrete. Dust shook loose from the top shelf. Behind it, a narrow service hatch emerged from the wall like a secret the bay had been too tired to keep. Ethan reached for the latch just as the outer door lock gave a soft mechanical click from the other side. Someone had found the right bay. And someone was coming in. The service hatch opened with the sound of old seals giving up. Ethan pulled it wide just enough for a person to slip through, and a breath of stale, metallic air rolled out from the darkness behind it, carrying the smell of dust, coolant residue, and the forgotten insides of a station that had been patched more times than it had ever been built correctly. Somewhere behind them, the outer bay lock clicked again, slower this time, followed by the low hydraulic hum of a door beginning to disengage. Whoever was outside had not come to knock. In, Ethan said. Lyra did not argue. She ducked through first, one hand gathering the silver-gray blanket tight around herself while the other kept hold of the black and gold relay. Ethan followed, pulling the hatch shut behind them just as the outer bay door rolled open with a long steel groan. Darkness swallowed them. Not total darkness. Dock 9 was too old to ever be completely dark. Thin lines of emergency wiring ran along the service corridor walls, glowing faint amber beneath layers of grime. Pipes crossed overhead in dense, sweating bundles, dripping condensation onto the grated floor below. The passage was barely 3 feet wide, forcing them into single file, and low enough that Ethan had to duck his head around a bent ventilation brace. "You built this?" Lyra whispered from a few feet ahead. "No," Ethan murmured. "But I have cursed it professionally for 6 years." She made a small sound that might have been approval. Ethan led her deeper into the crawl corridor, boots landing carefully on the grated floor to avoid the loose panels he knew would rattle. Behind the hatch, muffled through layers of steel, came the distant sound of movement in Bay 14. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just measured. Deliberate. That somehow made it worse. Ethan had spent enough time around security teams, inspection crews, and repo contractors to know the difference between people looking around and people who already believed the room belonged to them. These sounded like the second kind. He kept moving. The corridor turned left after about 20 feet, then dropped into a narrow utility run where the ceiling dipped low enough that even Lyra had to lower her head. The amber wiring painted her skin in soft gold as she glanced back at him over one shoulder. In the dark, with the station stripped down to pipes and metal and breath, she looked less like a stranger from the rain and more like some impossible thing Dock 9 had never been built to hold. "How many people know about this passage?" she asked quietly. 3, Ethan said. "Me, an electrician named Torres, and whatever ghost keeps stealing my socket set." "And this Torres?" "Too lazy to crawl in here unless the station is on fire." "That is reassuring. You say that like you have options." The corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile. Then it vanished just as quickly. Ethan noticed she had slowed. He moved up beside her and saw why. The narrow corridor opened into a maintenance junction no bigger than a walk-in closet, where old control panels lined one wall and a cracked monitor sat dark beneath a thick coat of dust. In the center of the room was a fold-down emergency bench, bolted crookedly to the wall. Lyra had one hand braced against the panel beside it. Her breathing was steady, but not easy. The adrenaline had carried her this far. Now the cold and exhaustion were collecting their debt. Ethan looked at her face in the low amber light and saw the faint sheen of strain around her eyes. "Sit," he said. "I am fine." "You say that a lot for someone who looks like she is about to argue with gravity." She gave him a look that under different circumstances might have been offended royalty. But after a second, she lowered herself onto the fold-down bench anyway. Ethan crouched near the old console and pulled off the front panel with a practiced twist of his pry tool. Inside, a tangle of dead comm lines and service ports blinked faint green. Old station tech. Slow. Ugly. Reliable. Exactly his kind of system. "What are you doing?" Lyra asked. "Checking if Bay 14 is still my problem." He plugged in his compact voltage tester and waited while the console sputtered reluctantly to life. Static hissed through a tiny speaker. Then a grainy schematic of the Bay grid flickered across the cracked monitor. One access door. One outer loading gate. 2 internal heat signatures. Ethan's. Lyra's. And now 3 more. All inside Bay 14. He felt his jaw tighten. "That is bad, I assume," Lyra said. Ethan leaned back on his heels and stared at the screen. "That depends," he said. "How many people were supposed to be looking for you?" She was quiet for just a beat too long. "Officially? That is already not a great start." 1. Ethan pointed at the monitor. "Well, congratulations. You brought friends." She stood too quickly, then steadied herself with one hand against the wall. Her gaze fixed on the 3 moving heat signatures with something colder than fear. Recognition again. Calculation. "They are not station personnel," she said. "No kidding. And they should not be here this fast." Ethan turned to look at her. "You keep saying that like there was a version of tonight where this was supposed to go smoothly." She did not answer. Instead, she looked down at the relay still. In her hand. The gold ring, which had gone dark earlier, was glowing again. Not bright. Just enough to make Ethan's stomach drop. "Lyra," he said carefully, "what exactly does that thing do when it is active?" She lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time since he met her, she looked genuinely unsettled. "It does not just let them find me," she said. "It tells them whether I am alone." Ethan stared at her for half a second. Then both of them looked at the monitor, where the 3 heat signatures in Bay 14 had just stopped moving. Not wandering. Not searching. Just standing still. Directly in front of the hidden service hatch they had used to escape. There is a special kind of silence that only shows up when a room realizes it has become part of someone else's plan. Ethan stared at the monitor as the 3 heat signatures held perfectly still on the other side of Bay 14, lined up in front of the hidden hatch like they had known exactly where to stop. Not guessing. Not searching. Waiting. The cracked display painted the utility junction in a weak green wash, turning Lyra's turquoise skin pale and ghost-like in the low light. She stood beside him with the black and gold relay in one hand, her jaw set so tightly it looked painful. "Tell me they cannot actually see through walls," Ethan said quietly. "Not through walls," Lyra answered. "Through patterns." Ethan looked up at her. "That is somehow worse." She nodded once, as if she agreed. "The relay reads proximity, motion, thermal spacing. It tells them whether I am isolated, whether I am moving, whether there is another life signature maintaining pace with mine." "So basically," Ethan said, "your little locator does not just scream 'here she is.' It also says congratulations, she made a friend." That is an unnecessarily cheerful way to describe it. Ethan let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if his pulse had not been trying to hammer its way out of his chest. "I cope with sarcasm. It is cheaper than therapy." On the monitor, one of the heat signatures shifted slightly to the left. Another remained fixed in front of the hatch. The third moved toward the main worktable in the bay, then stopped again. Ethan knew that room by instinct. He could picture every shelf, every loose bolt tray, every stain in the concrete. He could also picture exactly what those people were seeing: the dead heater, the empty noodle cup, his jacket missing from its hook, and a room that no longer looked abandoned. "They know we are in here," he said. "They strongly suspect," Lyra corrected. That is not comforting enough to matter. Ethan pushed himself to his feet and ran a hand through his hair, already thinking through the maintenance grid in his head. Bay 14 sat on the eastern service spine of Dock 9, which meant the crawl corridor they were in fed into 3 possible exits, one dead-end coolant chamber, one locked waste chute access nobody sane would use, and one ladder shaft leading up to the overhead catwalks above the civilian market level. If they moved fast, they could maybe make the catwalks before whoever was in the bay decided to start checking wall seams. How long before they open the hatch? He asked. Lyra glanced down at the relay, then at the monitor. If they are the people I think they are. She exhaled once. Soon. Ethan nodded toward the device in her hand. Then kill it. Her fingers tightened around the black casing. It is not that simple. I am from Earth, Ethan said. We hit things until they become simple. That almost got a smile out of her. Almost. But when she looked back at the relay, the expression faded. If I destroy it completely, she said, it triggers a loss event. Which means everyone with clearance receives a priority alert that I am either dead, taken, or no longer under authorized movement. Ethan stared at her for half a second. You know, every answer you give somehow manages to make this worse. I have noticed. He looked back at the monitor. One of the 3 signatures had crouched near the hidden hatch. The thermal shape sharpened, one arm lifting toward the wall. Ethan's whole body tensed. Move, he said. He grabbed the compact torch and voltage tester off the console, then crossed to the far side of the utility junction where a narrow maintenance ladder disappeared upward into darkness. The rungs were old alloy, slick with years of dust and pipe condensation. Above them, a circular service cover sat half-open beneath a bundle of insulated conduit. Lyra stepped up beside him. Where does that go? Market catwalks, Ethan said. If we are lucky. And if we are not? He put one boot on the first rung and looked back at her. Then we get to learn something exciting about waste disposal architecture. For the first time all night, she laughed. It was quiet and brief and tired, but real enough to make the room feel less like a trap for one strange, impossible second. Then a sharp metallic knock echoed through the wall behind them. Once. Deliberate. Not from the outer bay. From the hidden hatch itself. Ethan and Lyra both froze. Another knock followed. Not harder. Just certain. Then, through 2 layers of steel and old insulation, a voice came. Distorted. Calm. Male. Speaking in perfect station standard English. Miss Vale, it said, with the smooth patience of someone used to being obeyed. This has already become more inconvenient than necessary. Ethan turned slowly toward Lyra. She had gone completely still. Not with fear. With recognition so absolute it looked like impact. The voice spoke again, still measured, still maddeningly polite. Please understand, it said, the board would prefer your return to remain private. But if you continue to involve civilians, that option becomes harder to preserve. Ethan felt the words land like cold metal in his stomach. The board. Not bounty hunters. Not thieves. Something bigger. Older. Cleaner. He looked at Lyra, really looked at her, and for the first time all night the shape of the truth began to emerge in full. Whoever she was, she had not run from poverty. She had run from power. And power had just knocked on his wall and asked for her back by name. For a moment, Ethan forgot about the ladder. Forgot about the hatch. Forgot about the narrow walls of the utility junction and the 3 patient heat signatures waiting just beyond them. All he could hear was that voice through the steel, polished and calm and impossibly certain, saying her name like it belonged on legal documents and inheritance contracts and the kind of places men like Ethan only ever entered to sign debt forms. Miss Vale. He turned toward her slowly, the shape of the truth finally beginning to pull itself together in his head. Lyra did not look at him. She was staring at the wall as if she could see through it to the man on the other side. Her shoulders had gone rigid beneath Ethan's jacket, and the hand holding the relay was so tight the tendons in her wrist stood out pale under the amber light. "You know him," Ethan said quietly. It was not really a question. Her answer came just above a whisper. "Yes." Another pause. "Unfortunately." The voice beyond the hatch spoke again, still smooth, still patient. "Your absence has already destabilized 2 board negotiations, 1 route arbitration, and an acquisition vote that should have concluded 12 hours ago." Ethan blinked once, then looked back at the wall. Acquisition vote. Board negotiations. Route arbitration. He had spent years fixing cargo systems for companies so large they could bankrupt moons without noticing. He knew corporate language when he heard it. But this was not middle management nonsense or station-level ownership disputes. This sounded planetary. System level. The kind of money that never got counted in dollars because numbers that large stopped sounding real. "You have got to be kidding me," Ethan muttered. Lyra finally looked at him then, and there was something raw in her expression that had not been there before. Not weakness. Something worse. Exposure. "I was trying," she said softly, "to avoid exactly this conversation." Ethan gave a hollow laugh under his breath. "That makes 2 of us." The voice continued, as if it knew silence would only help its case. "Miss Vale, your current environment is neither secure nor dignified. This does not need to become an ordeal. Return voluntarily, and this unfortunate detour can still be treated as private misjudgment." Ethan saw the change in her before she spoke. The slight lift of her chin. The cooling of her expression. Whatever exhaustion, fear, or disorientation the night had carved into her, that voice was sanding it away and replacing it with something older. Sharper. She stepped toward the wall, not close enough to touch it, but close enough that when she answered, her voice carried clear through the metal. "If the board was concerned with dignity," she said, "it should have considered that before attempting to schedule my life like freight." Silence. Then, from the other side, the faintest exhale. Not frustration exactly. More like practiced patience adjusting its posture. "The merger is strategically necessary." Ethan looked at her. Merger. She looked straight ahead, amber eyes gone hard as polished stone. "For whom?" she asked. "For the system." The man replied. "For continuity. For market stability. For your family's legacy." Ethan did not know much about dynastic wealth, but he knew coercion when it wore a tailored suit. He also knew exactly what he was hearing now, not a rescue. Not even a retrieval. A negotiation that had stopped pretending to be one. He shifted his weight and looked between Lyra and the wall. "Okay," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "I do not know what half of this means, but I know a hostage pitch when I hear one." That got her attention. She looked at him, and for the first time since he met her, her composure cracked just enough for disbelief to show through. "You think I am a hostage?" Ethan frowned. "Aren't you?" She stared at him for a beat too long, as if no one had ever reduced her entire impossible situation to something that simple. Then her gaze dropped, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its steel. "In my world," she said quietly, "they would call it obligation." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the ladder and folded his arms. "In mine, we call that a red flag." The faintest ghost of a smile touched her mouth before disappearing. On the other side of the hatch, the man's voice returned, cooler now. "Miss Vale, I would advise you not to confuse temporary discomfort with oppression." Ethan's jaw tightened before he could stop it. Lyra, however, did not flinch. "And I would advise you," she said, each word measured and clean, "not to mistake silence for consent." The utility junction went still. Ethan felt something settle in the room after that. Not peace. Alignment. A line had been drawn, and for the first time all night he understood where he was standing in relation to it. He did not know her full name. Did not know what exactly she owned, what family she came from, or why men in polished voices were crawling through station walls to drag her back into a boardroom. But he knew this: whatever waited for her on the other side of that hatch was dressed up in too much money and too much language to call itself force, but it was force all the same. And suddenly, absurdly, that made the decision easier. Ethan stepped up beside her and raised his voice just enough to carry through the steel. "Hey," he called. "Quick question." A beat of silence answered him. Then, "Yes." Ethan glanced once at Lyra, saw the surprise in her face, and smiled without humor. "If she wanted to go with you," he said, "why are you still talking through a wall?" That one landed. The silence on the other side sharpened. Not because they had lost control. People like that did not lose control. They simply disliked being seen too clearly. Ethan could feel Lyra looking at him now, really looking at him, as if she had just watched a maintenance worker with grease under his nails say something to Power that Power was not accustomed to hearing. When the man finally answered, the velvet was gone from his tone. "You are involving yourself in matters beyond your understanding, Mr. Cole." Ethan's heartbeat stumbled. He had not given them his name. He did not let that show. "Yeah," he said, eyes on the hatch, "I had started to suspect that." Then he reached up, grabbed the first rung of the ladder, and looked at Lyra. "Come on," he said. "If your billionaire nightmare has a board of directors, I would really rather not meet the rest of them in a ventilation shaft." For 1 second she just stared at him. Then, despite everything, she laughed under her breath and stepped toward the ladder. And behind the wall, for the first time all night, the voice outside did not speak again. The ladder rattled softly under Ethan's weight as he climbed, one hand on the cold alloy rung, the other braced against the narrow shaft wall slick with old condensation. Above him, the circular service cover sat half ajar beneath a tangle of conduit and dust-thick cable bundles, leaking a pale strip of market-level light into the dark. Below, Lyra climbed without a sound, one hand steady on the rail, the other still holding that impossible black and gold relay like it had become less of a device and more of a consequence. Ethan kept moving. The utility shaft was barely 30 feet tall, but halfway up it already felt like they had climbed out of one life and into another. Beneath them, through steel and maintenance plating, Dock 9 continued breathing in its usual mechanical sleep. Distant freight alarms. Air exchangers. Somewhere far off, the hollow whine of a departing shuttle. Ordinary station noise. The kind that made extraordinary problems feel almost rude. Ethan pushed the service cover aside and pulled himself up into the narrow catwalk access corridor above the civilian market level. The air up there was warmer and carried a completely different smell than the lower docks. Fried starch. Synthetic citrus cleaner. Ozone from overworked ad projectors. Human and non-human life packed together under one tired ceiling. He crouched immediately and reached back to help Lyra up the last few rungs. Her hand caught his forearm for balance, cold but steadier than before, and for 1 second they both paused there in the half-light, too close to pretend they were not both running on instinct and very little sleep. Then the moment passed. Ethan lowered the hatch back into place and looked around. The corridor was exactly as ugly as he remembered. Narrow grated walkway. Rust along the seam joints. Old service signs in 3 dead trade languages. Through the slotted vent panels along the right side, he could see down into the sleeping market below, rows of closed vendor stalls, tarp-covered carts, hanging strings of cheap solar lanterns, and the occasional late-shift drifter crossing under neon signs reflected in puddles on the tile. "We head west," Ethan said quietly. "There is a stairwell near the old transit kiosks. From there we can cut through the market and lose them in the public levels." Lyra glanced down through the vent slats, then back at him. "You have done this before? Escaped a corporate retrieval team with a mystery heiress?" Ethan started walking, keeping his steps light on the metal grate. No. But I have dodged rent collectors, repo officers, and one very committed ex-landlord. There is overlap. To his surprise, she smiled. It was brief and tired and almost disbelieving, like she was still adjusting to the fact that someone could stand this close to danger and keep talking to it like it was just another broken machine. They moved down the corridor together, Ethan in front this time, his tool belt clinking softly at his hip with each careful step. The catwalk curved over the market's central atrium, and as they passed one of the wider vent breaks, moonpale light from the station's exterior hull windows spilled across Lyra's face. Ethan looked over without meaning to and saw what the lower dock lighting had hidden. She was exhausted, yes. Pale around the eyes. Too thin from stress and whatever she had been surviving on before he found her. But beneath that was something impossible to mistake now. Not just wealth. Not just status. Bearing. The kind people were raised into when entire rooms had spent their lives adjusting themselves around them. She caught him looking. What? She asked softly. Ethan looked ahead again. You really were not kidding about the whole diplomatic nightmare thing. For a few steps, she said nothing. Then, I did not lie to you. No, Ethan said. You just left out the part where people with board votes and locator relays crawl through ventilation systems when you disappear. I was hoping, she said after a pause, that part would stay theoretical. Ethan gave a quiet laugh under his breath. That is kind of your theme tonight, huh? The catwalk narrowed again where a maintenance support beam forced them single file. Lyra's voice came from just behind him, quieter now, more thoughtful than defensive. On my world, she said, people do not usually help without context. Ethan slowed slightly but did not stop. Meaning? Meaning, she said, there is usually a reason. Obligation. Optics. Strategy. Debt. Influence. Her voice dropped lower, almost lost under the hum of the ventilation fans overhead. Even kindness is often a transaction. Ethan did not answer right away. Ahead, the corridor bent left toward the transit side access stair. Below them, a cleaning drone rolled silently through the empty market, its little scrubber lights passing over closed stalls like a lazy tide. The whole station felt suspended between one version of itself and the next. Back there, Lyra said, when he spoke through the wall. Ethan glanced back over one shoulder. She was watching him with that same impossible amber gaze, but there was no suspicion in it now. Only something more dangerous. Curiosity. Why did you answer him like that? She asked. Why did you stay? Ethan stopped walking. Not because the question trapped him. Because it deserved an honest answer. He turned toward her fully in the dim corridor light, hands loose at his sides, and for a moment all the noise of the station seemed to pull back. Because, he said simply, you were cold. Lyra blinked once. Ethan shrugged, almost embarrassed by how small the truth sounded out loud. That is it, he said. You looked like you had not slept. You were sitting in the rain with a dead heater. And whatever else you are, or own, or are apparently worth to 6 men in expensive shoes, he shook his head once. That part came later. She just stared at him. No sarcasm. No polished comeback. No practiced distance. Like he had just handed her something she had never been offered before and she did not know where to put it. On your world, she said after a long silence, is that normal? Ethan thought about overdue bills. Broken shifts. Neighbors borrowing tools they forgot to return. Nurses bringing extra blankets. Mechanics staying late because some single mom could not afford another delay. Human beings being tired and flawed and selfish right up until the exact moment someone else needed them. Not always, he said. Just when it matters. Something in her face changed then. Not dramatic. Not visible from across a room. But Ethan saw it because he was standing 3 feet away and because the station light caught the shine in her eyes before she turned her head. She looked down through the vent slats at the sleeping market below, at all the cheap lights and patched lives and ordinary people who would wake up in a few hours and keep the whole rusting station alive by sheer stubbornness. "I think," she said very quietly, "your species is much stranger than mine was prepared for." Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "We get that a lot." Then, from somewhere below and far too close for comfort, a station speaker crackled to life. The market lights brightened by one shade. A calm automated voice rolled through the atrium. "Attention all civilian sectors. Temporary movement restrictions are now in effect pending executive transit clearance." Ethan and Lyra looked at each other at the exact same moment. Then Ethan muttered, "Well. That is not ominous at all," and started toward the stairwell at a run. By the time Ethan and Lyra reached the stairwell, Dock 9 no longer felt like a station. It felt like a checkpoint. The overhead market lights had shifted from sleepy amber to clean white, too bright for the hour and too precise to be routine. Down below, the civilian level was waking in the wrong way. Not with the slow drag of vendors rolling up shutters and food stalls heating. Cheap oil. This was quieter. Tighter. People were pausing mid-step. Looking up. Looking around. Reading the same invisible change in the air that Ethan felt crawling up the back of his neck. Executive transit clearance. That was not a phrase Dock 9 used for cargo disputes or customs sweeps. That was money language. Government language. The kind of language that made ordinary people instinctively lower their voices and move out of the way. Ethan hit the stairwell door and pushed through into a narrow steel tower spiraling down toward the market floor. The walls vibrated faintly with station-wide systems coming online somewhere above them. "How bad is executive transit clearance?" he asked, taking the steps two at a time. Lyra followed close behind, one hand brushing the rail for balance. "Bad enough that no one below a certain pay grade is supposed to ask what it means." Ethan gave a humorless laugh. "Great. My favorite category of problem." They dropped 2 flights before Ethan slowed and peered through the wire mesh landing toward the market below. The sight waiting for them stopped him cold. The central atrium had gone still. Not empty. Still. Vendors who should have been opening were standing behind half-raised shutters, staring toward the station's eastern docking windows. Night porters, cleaners, delivery runners, and a few sleepless drifters had all drifted toward the same side of the concourse without meaning to, pulled by the same silent gravity. Even from here, Ethan could feel it. Something had arrived. "What now?" Lyra asked softly behind him. Ethan did not answer right away. He stepped closer to the mesh and looked past the hanging ad screens, past the rows of closed kiosks, through the long reinforced glass of Dock 9's exterior viewing wall. At first all he saw was rain and reflected station light. Then the darkness outside shifted. Not because something moved into view. Because something large enough to redefine the view had already been there, and his eyes had only just figured out how to understand it. A ship hung outside the dock windows like a piece of night carved into shape. Black hull. Gold edge lighting. No visible cargo markings. No public registry flare. No commercial insignia Ethan recognized. It was not built like freight, military, or civilian luxury. It was built like certainty. Smooth, severe, expensive enough to make the rest of Dock 9 look temporary by comparison. The vessel floated beyond the outer docking lattice in absolute stillness, too elegant to need to prove it could land. Beneath it, station service craft looked like insects. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That," he said, "is a deeply upsetting amount of money." Lyra stepped up beside him and looked through the mesh. For the first time since he had met her, she looked genuinely caught off guard. Not by the ship itself. By the fact that it was here. "They should not have brought that," she said under her breath. "Why?" Ethan asked. "Because if they brought a flagship," she said quietly, "this is no longer private." The words settled between them like cold metal. Ethan looked back down at the market floor. More station personnel were appearing now at the perimeter corridors. Not security in riot gear or armed enforcement. Worse. Clean uniforms. Administrative access teams. Transit officials. People whose entire job was to make extraordinary authority look procedural. No one was shouting. No one needed to. The station was already making room. Okay, Ethan said, forcing himself to think. New plan. You have one. Not yet. But I have panic with structure. He looked around the stairwell landing and spotted an old service map bolted to the wall beneath a cracked emergency beacon. He stepped toward it and wiped grime from the faded screen with the heel of his hand. The map flickered reluctantly to life. Market level. Transit kiosks. Vendor spine. Public customs corridor. Maintenance underpass. Ethan's eyes tracked the routes automatically, years of station logic falling into place in his head like muscle memory. If they are locking civilian movement, he said, they will control the obvious exits first. Main concourse, transit gates, docking elevators. He tapped the lower corner of the map. But there is an old freight underpass here. Used to connect produce vendors to cold storage before the lease merger. Half the station forgot it exists. Lyra stepped closer, looking over his shoulder. Where does it lead? Backside of the customs wing, Ethan said. If we can reach it before your executive nightmare seals the floor, we might still disappear into the worker tunnels. She studied the map, then him. You say that as if disappearing is a skill. On Dock 9, Ethan said, stepping away from the screen, survival and invisibility are basically cousins. He started down the next flight, but Lyra did not move. Ethan turned. She was still looking through the stairwell mesh at the ship outside, her face unreadable in the hard white station light. Lyra, he said. She looked at him slowly. That is not a retrieval vessel, she said. That is a declaration. Ethan frowned. Meaning? Her voice was very quiet when she answered. Meaning someone important enough to command it is aboard. Ethan held her gaze for half a second, then glanced once more through the mesh toward the black and gold ship hanging beyond the dock windows like a verdict waiting to be spoken. Okay, he said, pulse beginning to climb again. I am going to need your life to stop escalating every 15 minutes. But before either of them could move, the station speakers crackled overhead once more, and this time the automated voice was replaced by a real one. Smooth. Male. Familiar. The same voice from behind the hatch. Calm enough to make the entire market feel colder. Attention, Dock 9, it said. By authority of the Vale Interstellar Board, all transit lanes are temporarily suspended pending the safe return of company principal Lyra Vale. Ethan went still. Around them, even the market seemed to stop breathing. Then the voice delivered the final line, and suddenly the whole station knew exactly who had been sleeping under its broken lights. Any civilian found assisting her continued disappearance, it said, will be considered in obstruction of executive recovery. Ethan turned slowly to look at Lyra. Not a drifter. Not a diplomat. Not just wealthy. Company principal. Vale. The name hit like a door finally opening. And in the silence that followed, he understood something all at once and all too late. The woman he had pulled out of the rain did not just belong to power. She was power. And half the station had just learned her face. The announcement did not end when the voice cut off. It lingered in the station like static in a wire. Ethan could feel it moving through the market below them, changing the shape of every glance, every pause, every half-second of hesitation in people who had no idea what a veil looked like until one had apparently spent the night under a broken heater 3 levels beneath their rent notices and food carts. He looked at Lyra and for the first time allowed the scale of it to land properly. Vale Interstellar. Even a dock mechanic on a half-rotting trade station knew that name. Not because people like Ethan followed corporate dynasties, but because companies that large stopped being companies. They became weather. Shipping routes. Oxygen contracts. Fuel access. Housing rights. Customs law. They became the invisible machinery ordinary lives got trapped inside without ever seeing the hands that moved it. And she had been sitting in the rain eating instant noodles out of a paper cup. Ethan stared at her for a second too long. "You own the station," he said finally. Lyra's expression shifted, not offended exactly, but tired in a way that looked older than the night. "No," she said quietly. "My family owns the holding group that owns the consortium that controls the transit rights for this station." Ethan blinked. "That is somehow worse." Against all reason, she smiled. It was brief, but real enough to survive the moment. "Yes," she said. "It usually is." Down below, the market had begun to move again, but differently now. Not like a place waking up. Like a place trying very hard to behave normally while knowing it had just been placed inside someone else's orbit. A food vendor pulled his half-open shutter down again. A pair of porters quietly reversed course and vanished into a side corridor. Even the cleaning drones seemed to reroute. Executive power did not need to shout. It only needed to be named. Ethan looked through the stairwell mesh toward the docking windows where the black and gold flagship still hung outside the station like a polished threat. "How much of that ship is here for you?" he asked. Lyra folded Ethan's jacket more tightly around herself, though the stairwell was not cold. "All of it," she said. "That vessel does not travel for cargo or ceremony. It moves when the board believes a problem has become too visible to ignore." Ethan let out a slow breath. "And you are the problem." "At the moment, yes." He rubbed a hand over his face and laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "I really picked a weird night to be decent." That made her look at him. Really look at him. Not with the polished reserve she had worn like armor all night, but with something closer to disbelief. "You still think this is about decency?" she asked. Ethan frowned. "What else would it be?" She was quiet for a beat. The stairwell lights hummed overhead. Somewhere below, a market cart wheel squealed against tile, then went silent. "Most people," she said carefully, "would have left by now." Ethan shrugged one shoulder. "Most people did not offer you shelter in a repair closet. That is my point." He looked at her, then out through the mesh again. "Lyra," he said, choosing the words as he went, "I do not know anything about board politics or system ownership or whatever kind of nightmare uses the phrase executive recovery before sunrise. But I know what it looks like when somebody does not want to go somewhere." He turned back to face her fully. "And I know what it sounds like when everyone around them keeps pretending they do." The silence that followed was small and enormous at the same time. Lyra held his gaze as if she had not expected him to say something that plain, and maybe that was the thing she had not been prepared for all along. Not human kindness in the abstract. Not moral philosophy. Just a mechanic from Earth reducing an interstellar power struggle to the one truth nobody around her seemed willing to use. Wanting matters. "On my world," she said at last, her voice almost too soft to hear, "choice is often treated like a luxury." Ethan leaned against the stair rail, eyes on her. "Then your world sounds broken." She let out the smallest breath of a laugh, but her eyes were shining now in the hard white station light, and he had the strange, aching feeling that nobody had ever said that to her without wanting something in return. "It is efficient," she said. "That is usually how they justify it." Ethan nodded once. "Yeah. We do that too. We just put worse branding on it." For a second, they were both smiling. Not because anything was safe. Because in the middle of all that machinery and money and pressure, something absurdly human had managed to survive anyway. Then the relay in Lyra's hand pulsed gold again. Once. Then twice. Her smile vanished. Ethan straightened immediately. What now? She looked down at the device, then toward the docking windows, her expression tightening with something close to dread. That is not a search ping, she said. That is a transfer acknowledgement. Ethan frowned. English. Someone else just boarded. The station. He followed her gaze to the flagship beyond the glass. The vessel had not moved, but now one of its lower docking arrays had opened, and a sleek black shuttle was descending toward Dock 9's executive berth with the silent precision of something that had never been told no in its life. Who? Ethan asked. Lyra did not answer right away. The color had drained from her face, leaving her turquoise skin pale beneath the station lights. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. The one person, she said, I was hoping had stayed off the ship. Ethan looked from the descending shuttle to her and felt the whole night tilt again. That is not a comforting sentence. It was not meant to be. Then, before Ethan could ask anything else, a new voice came over the station speakers. Not the board representative from before. This one was deeper. Colder. And somehow far worse because it did not need to sound polite to be obeyed. It spoke only one sentence, and the entire station seemed to tighten around it. Lyra, the voice said, calm as vacuum and twice as merciless, you have made your point. Come home. Lyra closed her eyes for 1 second, and when she opened them again, Ethan saw it clearly at last. Not fear of the board. Not fear of power. Something more personal than that. The kind of fear reserved for someone who knows exactly where to place their hand on your life and call it duty. That, she said very quietly, is my mother. Some people can wound you without ever raising their voice. Ethan had known that in theory. He had seen it in landlords, supervisors, men with polished shoes and expensive patience. But hearing it in the station speakers, hearing that single sentence land over Dock 9 like a command disguised as concern, he understood something uglier. Real power did not always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrived sounding like family. Lyra stood motionless beside the stairwell mesh, the black and gold relay dim in her hand, her face gone so still it almost looked calm. But Ethan had spent the last several hours learning the difference between stillness and peace, and this was not peace. This was impact held upright by training. Your mother, he repeated quietly, because his brain refused to produce anything more useful. Lyra gave the smallest nod. Below them, the market remained suspended in that strange, brittle hush that only happens when ordinary people realize something far above their lives has just entered the room. Vendors stood behind half-open shutters pretending not to listen. Porters slowed near corridor junctions. Even the cleaning drones seemed to move more carefully. The station had become an audience to a private war wearing corporate insignia. Ethan looked through the mesh toward the executive docking berth. The black shuttle had completed its descent and now sat attached to Dock 9 with a precision that felt insulting. No rush. No confusion. Just certainty. Okay, he said, more to keep himself moving than because he had a real plan. New question. Is your mother the kind of person who sends a dramatic voice announcement and then waits politely in a lounge? Lyra's gaze stayed fixed on the shuttle. No, good. I hate being surprised by competence. That finally made her blink, like his stupidity had cut through the fog just enough to let her breathe. Ethan stepped down one stair, then another, forcing his thoughts into sequence. Panic was useless. Logistics were not. The old freight underpass was still their best option, but if someone as important as Lyra's mother had boarded personally, then the station's executive access corridors would already be locking down in concentric rings. Public levels first. Worker routes second. Utility access last. That gave them a window. Small, ugly, and probably full of mold, but a window. Come on, he said. We move before your family turns the whole station into a conference room. Lyra did not follow. Ethan turned. She was still standing at the landing, eyes lowered now, shoulders drawn inward in a way he had not seen from her before. Not weakness. Where? The kind that came from carrying a role so long your spine forgot what your own shape was supposed to be. Ethan, she said quietly. He stopped. What? Her fingers tightened around the relay. If she is here in person, then this ends one of two ways. Ethan frowned. I am not loving the menu already. She looked up at him, and the expression on her face was the clearest thing he had seen all night. No polished reserve. No careful omission. Just truth, stripped clean. Either I go back with her, she said, or she makes an example of the station until I do. The words hit harder than they should have. Maybe because Ethan believed her instantly. He had not met Lyra's mother, but he already knew the type. People who did not think of pressure as cruelty because to them pressure was just architecture. Systems. Incentives. Consequences. They never considered themselves violent because they rarely had to touch anything directly. No, Ethan said. Lyra blinked. No. No, he repeated, stepping back up until he was level with her again. You do not get to say that like those are the only options. Something flickered across her face. Not hope exactly. Hope was too loud. This was smaller. More fragile. Like the first crack in a sealed window. That is kind of you, she said. It is also incorrect. Ethan folded his arms. You know what I think your problem is? I suspect you are about to tell me. You have been surrounded by people with so much money and so little imagination that they genuinely forgot other options exist. Lyra stared at him for a second, then let out one disbelieving breath that almost became a laugh. That is an outrageous thing to say about an interstellar board. Yeah, Ethan said. And yet I stand by it. For one brief second, the tension in her shoulders loosened. Then the relay pulsed again, brighter this time, and a new sound rolled through the stairwell. Not from the speakers. From below. Footsteps. Measured. Approaching from the market-level entrance. Ethan's head snapped toward the lower landing. Someone was coming up. Not a crowd. One person. Slow enough to be deliberate. Confident enough not to hurry. Lyra heard it too. Her expression changed instantly. That is her, she whispered. Ethan looked at the stairwell below, then at Lyra, then back again. He should have moved. Should have grabbed her hand and dragged her toward the freight underpass while they still had seconds to waste. Instead, something stubborn and deeply human rooted him exactly where he was. No, he said again, quieter this time. What are you doing? Lyra asked, and for the first time all night there was actual alarm in her voice. Ethan set his tool belt down on the stair landing and crouched beside the old service map mounted to the wall. He popped the cracked panel open with his pry tool and exposed the manual junction board behind it, a mess of outdated station circuits and emergency override relays. Buying time, he said. You cannot stop an executive lockdown from a stairwell wall panel. Watch me fail creatively. The footsteps below continued, calm and unhurried. Ethan's fingers moved fast now, years of instinct taking over. Red wire. Secondary bus. Maintenance bypass. Dock 9 was a rusted miracle held together by underfunded repair crews and prayer. Which meant its systems still had one beautiful weakness left in them: they could be confused by someone who actually understood how ugly they were inside. Ethan, Lyra said again, closer now, voice tight. If you do this, they will know you helped me. He did not look up. Pretty sure they crossed that bridge around the time they used my full name over a speaker. This could cost you everything. That made him pause. Just for a heartbeat. Not because she was wrong. Because she was not. Job. Housing. Station access. Blacklisting, maybe worse. The kind of consequences people like her family never had to say out loud because everyone else already knew how expensive defiance could become. Ethan looked up at her then, really looked at her, and saw not the heiress, not the company principal, not the woman half the system apparently expected to obey on command. Just a person standing in a stairwell, asking him to save himself because nobody in her world had ever stayed when the price became visible. "Yeah," he said softly. "Maybe." Then he slid the bypass into place. The panel sparked once. Somewhere deep in the bones of Dock 9, something old and electrical woke up angry. The market lights below flickered hard. The station speakers crackled. Then every corridor alarm on the civilian level lit at once in a screaming wash of red and amber as emergency shutters began dropping across the wrong sectors in the wrong order. Not a full shutdown. Worse. Chaos. Beautiful, bureaucratic chaos. Ethan stood, grabbed his tool belt, and looked at Lyra with the kind of grim satisfaction only a mechanic could feel after weaponizing bad infrastructure. "Turns out," he said, as the approaching footsteps below finally stopped, "your mother may own half the star system." He nodded toward the flashing stairwell, where Dock 9 had just descended into pure procedural confusion. "But I know this station better than she does." When the alarms hit, Dock 9 forgot how to pretend. Red strobes washed across the stairwell walls in slow rotating pulses, painting everything in emergency color and making the steel look wet. Somewhere below, mechanical shutters slammed down out of sequence across the market corridors. Somewhere above, an automated voice tried and failed to decide whether this was a fire, a pressure fault, or a transit lockdown. The whole station had been shoved off script, and for one glorious minute, every expensive plan in the building had to compete with bad wiring and municipal panic. Ethan grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her down the opposite service landing before the system could correct itself. Her fingers were cold and light in his, but this time she did not hesitate. They moved fast through the lower stairwell, boots ringing on steel steps, emergency lights flickering overhead in staggered bursts. At the base of the tower, Ethan kicked open a maintenance side door and led her into the old freight underpass just as the main market corridor beyond sealed behind a descending shutter with a hydraulic crash. The underpass smelled like damp concrete, old coolant, and the stale mineral cold of places designed only for function. Narrow ceiling. Exposed conduit. Pipe shadows stretching long and black under the red alarm wash. It was ugly, forgotten, and perfect. "How long do we have?" Lyra asked, breathless but steady. Ethan kept moving. "On a normal station? 10 minutes. On Dock 9. He ducked under a low-hanging valve wheel and glanced back at her. "Could be 30 seconds. Could be 3 hours. Depends how embarrassed the infrastructure feels." Against everything around them, she laughed. Not politely. Not carefully. A real laugh, startled out of her by stress and disbelief and the sheer absurdity of trusting a half-broken dock to outmaneuver a corporate dynasty. The sound hit Ethan harder than it should have. It made all of this feel real in the strangest possible way. Not the board. Not the flagship. Her. Still here. Still choosing motion over surrender. They reached the split in the underpass where one route curved toward customs intake and the other climbed toward old worker access near the station's rear observation ring. Ethan slowed. Ahead, through a grated service opening, he could see the rear windows of Dock 9 glowing with the faint blue-black light of open space. No crowds there. No vendors. No board representatives. Just the quiet back edge of the station where the rich never bother to look because there was nothing there to own. "This way," he said. They emerged a minute later into the observation ring, and the silence hit like a different kind of weather. After the alarms and voices and fluorescent panic of the station core, the rear ring felt impossibly still. It was an old public corridor with half the benches removed and most of the glass panels scratched by decades of drifting cargo dust. One coffee kiosk sat dark in the corner. A children's gravity display blinked sleepily in standby mode. Beyond the long curved windows, stars burned cold and steady above the planet's blue limb. And there, reflected faintly in the glass, hung the black and gold flagship that had come to collect its missing heir. Ethan stopped. So did Lyra. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. They just stood there under the dim emergency wash, breathing hard, staring out at the ship and the stars and the absurd scale of the thing that had somehow collided with both of their lives before dawn. Then Lyra stepped closer to the glass. The reflection of the flagship drifted over her face like a shadow trying to remember her shape. "If I leave now," she said quietly, "this all stops." Ethan looked at her, then out at the ship. "You mean if you surrender?" She did not flinch at the word. "If I go willingly, they stand down. The station returns to normal. Your name stays out of whatever comes next." Ethan let out a breath and leaned against the cold window frame beside her. "That is a very polished way to describe being dragged back into a life you ran from. It is also true." He looked at her profile in the glass. Silver white hair. Turquoise skin. Eyes that had probably seen boardrooms, embassies, private fleets, and polished futures designed by people who had never once asked what she actually wanted. "Do you want to go?" he asked. That was all. No speech. No strategy. Just the question nobody around her ever seemed willing to make simple. Lyra closed her eyes. When she answered, her voice was so quiet he almost did not hear it. "No," Ethan nodded once, like that settled everything. Because to him, it did. "Then that is the only part one care about." She turned. To look at him fully then, and whatever she had been holding together all night finally shifted. Not broken. Released. Her eyes shone in the dim light, not with dramatic tears or cinematic collapse, but with the quiet shock of someone realizing they had been given permission to be a person instead of a role. "Why?" she asked, and it was not a challenge this time. It was genuine. "Why does that matter so much to you?" Ethan looked out at the stars for a second before answering. Thought about every small thing that made humans what they were. Not powerful enough to own systems. Not elegant enough to command fleets. Just stubborn, flawed creatures who kept insisting that choice and dignity and warmth still mattered even inside broken worlds. "Because where I come from," he said softly, "people are not cargo." The word settled into the room like light. Lyra stared at him as if something inside her had just been named for the first time. Then, very slowly, she looked back toward the flagship outside. The relay in her hand glowed once, then dimmed. She turned it over in her palm, studying the smooth black casing and gold ring that had tracked her like property all night. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked. Her gaze stayed on the device. "Something irresponsible. That has been kind of our theme." A small smile touched her mouth. Then, before Ethan could ask anything else, she stepped to the old emergency comm pedestal near the observation window and pressed the relay directly against its open receiver port. The pedestal sparked once, then hummed to life with a rising tone. Across the ring, the scratched window glass reflected not just stars now, but a sudden bloom of gold data light running through the station network like sunlight underwater. Ethan straightened. "Lyra?" She looked at him, and there was something transformed in her expression now. Not just relief. Decision. "That relay does not only track me," she said. "It carries board authentication, route ownership, voting authority, emergency asset control, and executive override keys." Ethan stared. "You are telling me that thing is basically half the company?" "Closer to half the system," she said. Then she turned back to the comm pedestal and touched the final command. Outside the observation glass, the flagship's gold-edged lights flickered once. Then again. Then, impossibly, the entire vessel dimmed to standby. Docking authority revoked. Command access severed. Somewhere across Dock 9, station systems began correcting themselves all at once. Shutters unlocking. Alarms dying. Transit lanes restoring. The board had not withdrawn. It had been outranked. Ethan looked at Lyra with his mouth slightly open. You just shut down your own people's ship. Temporarily, she said. Very publicly. That seems bold. My mother values image. Lyra's eyes never left the darkened flagship outside. She will not drag me aboard a powerless vessel in front of station witnesses after I have invoked independent principal rights. Ethan blinked. You have independent what now? She looked at him, and for the first time since the rain outside Bay 14, there was no fear in her face at all. Only clarity. I did not run away to disappear, she said. I ran away to choose. The observation ring fell silent after that. No alarms. No voices. Just the soft hum of restored station power and the faint vibration of Dock 9 settling back into itself. Out beyond the glass, the stars remained what they had always been, enormous, indifferent, beautiful. And reflected in that vast black curve of space stood a dock mechanic from Earth and an alien woman who had just defied half the machinery of her own civilization with one honest decision. Ethan let out a slow breath. So, he said at last, what happens now? Lyra looked at the stars, then at him. Her answer came with the quiet certainty of someone hearing her own life in her own voice for the first time. Now, she said, they learn I meant no. And somewhere deep in the station, dawn finally reached the windows.